got to know a few of the locals pretty well. They frequented a place called Pho, where it had that rare thing called cold beer and warm soup. And it was really good. He knew it was good because all the foreign correspondents, or many of them, seemed to show up there periodically. They knew the best places. It was owned by a guy named Juan and his family. Juan's father and mother had set it up during the early 50s, during the French occupation. So he had learned a lot of French cooking skills, passed it on to Juan. It had become a very popular spot. Juan was always friendly to Jesse and his buddies, so they tipped him, and his two daughters, they played with the daughters. They became, his family. His last time out and about in Saigon, toward the end of Jesse's tour, Juan began feeling a little anxious, or he seemed to get anxious. Juan kept asking what Jesse had heard. Juan was hearing that the Americans were getting tired of the war and that the Viet Cong were on the move. Jesse assured him that that was not so, that everything seemed to be pretty calm, and besides, he'd be going off, this was his last tour, he's going back home in November. Christmas was coming up, 1974. Well, those of us that know, the Spring Tet Offensive began in December of 1974. And from America, Jesse watched as they plucked the last soldiers off the roof of the embassy on April 30th, 1975. And he thought of his friends, and he thought of the Juan family. Those and other thoughts maybe passed through Jesse's mind as he sat there in that restaurant in Colleur. After looking out the window for God knows how long, Jesse turned his head to see this Asian, middle-aged woman staring straight at him. And he was just like, what is up? And he was getting a little ticked off, but then she recognized him before he recognized her. She introduced herself. She was An Ha, oldest daughter of Juan. Here in this little restaurant in this little town in France, Jesse and his wife didn't go anywhere for a long, long while as An Ha, in her broken French, Vietnamese, and English, told Jesse and Deb how they were able to find a boat in 1981 with about 100 other people, and they got out onto the South China Sea, and it was very choppy, and they got out into the middle of the South China Sea, and their boat began to wallow because it was getting really rough, and the merchant ships were passing them by, and they had all these women and children, and miracle of miracles, their last flare they sent up, and an Australian ship called the Melbourne plucked them up out of the sea. They got back to Australia, and Juan had always wanted to go to France to practice his cooking there. So the whole family, except for one daughter, the youngest daughter, stayed in Australia and married one of the sailors from the Melbourne. But the rest of the family went to France. In Colleur, they started their restaurant. They say that over 1 million Vietnamese left communist Vietnam in little boats after America left. Thousands died on the South China Sea. Jesse couldn't imagine how or what had led him or his wife to this little restaurant. But he said, I'm not a religious man, but I will go to my grave thanking God for sending me this message. And I don't even know what the message is, but I do know that God is watching over me. God is loved me and the Juan family enough to send me halfway across this world to find each other and to find some sort of peace. After I pulled this story out of some old files earlier this week, I looked up the name Juan and An Ha on Google. The Vietnamese create names from words that mean something in their language. Juan means spring, and An Ha means peace river. Upon reflection, I've got to believe that Jesse's meeting with An Ha after all those years had been a resurrection of sorts for Jesse and Deborah. They were just beginning to experience a new life by remembering spring and basking in the light of peace. This miraculous meeting broke through the war-formed logjam in Jesse's heart till his life again began flowing like a river. He'd come out of his darkness. I don't know what this story means to you, but to me it means that even in our darkest moments, there is a way forward. This morning, we awake, and it is still dark, but carried through the darkness on the lips of a woman, Mary Magdalene, who has seen and believed, comes this word. Wake up! Morning has broken. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Amen.